Well, if that screen's showing okay, Ben, I think it is. We shall make a start, and I'll introduce myself. I'm Pete Berry from the UK. I work for a company called ADAS. I'm one of the thematic leaders, and I'm the thematic lead of crops management. And one of the roles of the thematic leads is to organise various meetings. And the first one, which I'm organising, is one which focuses on quantifying the sources of carbon emissions associated with crop production and what the best mitigation methods are for reducing carbon. So the aims of the meeting are to identify what the primary sources of carbon emissions are associated with growing the main arable crops. So we're focusing on arable crops, and the main ones: cereals, pulses, oilseeds, and the other ones which are sort of mainly grown in the different regions. We'll leave it for another meeting to deal with other crops, such as horticultural crops. We want to assess whether there's big differences in carbon emissions between crop species and geographic regions. And we want to look at the main mitigation methods for reducing carbon emissions. And then at the end of the meeting, we want to agree what our next topics are for next meetings. So here's our agenda. It's really split into two main parts. The first part focusing on quantifying the carbon emissions from the main arable crops. And you can see we've got speakers there from different regions involved in the Climate Farm Demo project. And then the second part is focusing on mitigation methods. And then towards the end, we'll decide what topics we want to focus on for the future meetings. When each presenter starts, I'm going to ask them to just introduce themselves before they describe their slides. There's a question period after each of the main sessions, so you'll have a chance then to ask questions and to discuss things. We want as much interaction as possible within our 2-hour meeting. So if you have a question or a comment that you want to make, then the best way is going to be to open the chat by clicking on this button here and then adding your message in the chat, and one of the presenters will reply to your question or comment during the meeting. Also, if you want to, then we'll have a period of questions after each sort of half of the meeting. And if you want to sort of us to unmute your microphone, then just put your hand up and we will do that, or ask that in the chat. So that's the way, just to raise your hand and then we can unmute your microphone in the question session. Okay, so I'm going to start by firstly just giving some definitions so that we don't get too lost, and to describe the methodology used to calculate carbon emissions for our UK work. These won't be the same as the methodology used for other regions, but they will be fairly similar, I think. So I'm going to go into a bit of detail about the methodology. There won't be as much detail about the methodology from the other presenters, but I think it's important to sort of have the outline of how carbon emissions have been estimated for this presentation. So firstly, in terms of definitions, we are talking about carbon emissions, and we are quantifying these in terms of the equivalent warming effect of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. And we equate those in terms of equivalent carbon dioxide warming effect. So that's carbon dioxide E, carbon dioxide equivalent, that stands for. And so we can compare on a like-for-like basis by looking at all those three greenhouse gases. Within the presentations, you'll see greenhouse gas used. That effectively equates to carbon emissions. You'll also see carbon emissions referred to as C emissions, C obviously short for carbon, or C footprint. So you'll see all these terms during the next few slides. In terms of crop production, we're really focusing on two main types of greenhouse gas, those being the carbon dioxide and the nitrous oxide. The main sources of carbon dioxide are fossil fuels, so electricity and tractor fuel, and fuel used, for example, for grain drying. And there's also carbon dioxide emitted when urea fertilizers are applied to the soil and when lime is applied. And then the other main source is nitrous oxide, and there's various sort of sources of nitrous oxide. One being the application of manufactured nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, the application of organic materials to the soil, decomposition of crop residues through mineralization, and the process of biological nitrogen fixation. So they can all add nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. And as I say, when we're talking about carbon emissions, we're equating it in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, so the equivalent warming effects of CO2 and nitrous oxide. For the UK work, we've categorized the carbon emissions into 8 different categories as described in this pie chart. This is like just an example of the greenhouse gas emissions which occur for winter wheat in the UK. And these 8 categories are really can be split into 3 divisions. So you've got firstly the embedded emissions. So these come from the greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing the seed which is planted, the emissions associated with manufacturing the ag chemicals such as the fungicides, the herbicides, the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer, and the manufacture of non-nitrogen fertilizers such as phosphorus and potassium fertilizers. We've then got a second category which is all about energy, fuel, diesel fuel mainly, and electricity. And then we've got the direct and indirect nitrous oxide emissions associated with nitrogen fertilizer application, manure applications or other organic materials, and the decomposition of crop residues. So that's sort of a broad overview of the sources of emissions. And I'm now going to just give a bit of detail on how we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with each source. So for the embedded emissions, for the seed and the agrochemicals, it's a simple calculation, really. It's the activity, which it might be the kilograms of seed that are planted, times the emissions factor. For seed, we use data from a European Commission database. For the agrochemicals, we base this on the kilograms of active ingredient applied per hectare, multiplied by the emissions factor associated with manufacturing that product. And that's sourced from various places. Green et al. From quite a long time ago, I must admit, has quite a lot of the data we use. But if there's more recent figures, then we will use those. This is a really important part, the embedded emissions with manufacturing of fertilizers. This reference, Brentrup et al., is a very good source of sort of standard information for manufacturing greenhouse gas emissions for fertilizers. But more commonly, we're finding that some of the fertilizer manufacturers have calculated accredited carbon footprints associated with their products. So CF fertilizers, for example, have got this information, Origin fertilizers, and overall, across all the fertilizers which we've been dealing with, about 28% can be calculated in this way, but the actual manufacturers have calculated specific footprints. We make an assumption that all of the fertilizer used in the UK has been manufactured somewhere in the EU. In terms of operations, we use a reference by Williams et al. From a few years ago, which describes the amount of energy required for a specific operation, and that might be for ploughing, for example, or drilling the crop, or applying a spray. And then we use an emissions factor to convert the fuel use into kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Operations include all of those there, all the way through to drying the grain. For drying the grain, does amount to quite a lot of carbon emissions for some crops, so it's an important thing to get right. We estimate the weight of material being dried and how much has got to be dried by, and then we assume this emissions factor of about 10 kilos of CO2 per tonne of crop product. It could be wheat grain, for example, per percentage of moisture loss that's required. Nitrous oxide emissions, four main sources here. We use this reference here about the UK greenhouse gas inventory. We calculate the direct emissions from the soil following fertilizer application, the indirect emissions from ammonia volatilization following fertilizer application, indirect emissions from nitrate leaching, and direct emissions from decomposing crop material that's left in the field after harvest. We take account of rainfall. The more rainfall that there is, there's more nitrous oxide emissions, which are likely. So the emissions factors modified by the amount of annual rainfall at that particular site of interest. Urea has lower direct emissions, but it has higher indirect emissions via volatilization. If an inhibitor is used, such as a nitrification inhibitor, then we assume that that reduces the nitrous oxide emissions from ammonium nitrate by 44%. If a urease inhibitor is used, then we assume 70% and 44% reduction in the indirect volatilization emissions for urea and urea ammonium nitrate. So that's sort of a liquid fertilizer applied. For organic materials, we assume that the direct emissions from these are based on the total nitrogen content of the manure or the organic material, and indirect emissions associated with volatilization are based on the total ammoniacal content of nitrogen in the organic material. So it's a big accounting process. It's continually being updated as new figures become available. And what we've done over the last few years in the UK is set up a network of farmers and industry sponsors and scientists, which we call the Yield Enhancement Network, and call it YEN for short. So that's the Yield Enhancement Network, and we call it the YEN Zero because it's all about how to reduce carbon emissions associated with crop production. We have lots of farmers involved. We've got 92 farmers involved, and this is where they are located in the UK. The network is sponsored by industry, and it has several scientists involved in it for calculating the greenhouse gas emissions. This gives you a sort of a picture of the crops which our farmers grew and provided information about. So we calculated the carbon footprint of each of their crops. You can see that winter wheat is by far the most prevalent, and then all-seed rape, and then spring barley, and then winter wheat used for milling, and then winter barley. So those are the main crops which we've been calculating the carbon footprint for in the UK, but you can see a wide range of crops altogether. Just to give you a picture really of the types of management which those crops are undergoing in the UK, we have a range of cultivations used in the UK, so 17% of our crops are still ploughed, and by contrast, 30% are direct drilled, with the rest with intermediate levels of cultivation intensity. About 30% of the crops have a cover crop following them. About a third of the crops have manure applied, and a pretty small proportion have fertilizer inhibitors such as nitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors, But it is worth mentioning that sort of for wheat and oilseed rape, there's a larger proportion of the crops, proportionally more of those crops have a fertilizer inhibitor applied. So let's have a look at the results. So when we use the methodology described to calculate the carbon footprint for those crops, and this is the sort of data we get. So this is the carbon footprint in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per hectare. This is the axis we're looking at here. And the green column represents the greenhouse gas emissions per hectare or carbon emissions per hectare. And the orange dot here represents the number of crops within which this has been calculated for. So you can see that for winter wheat, for feed, we have about 160 crops that this has been calculated for, and that's the most commonly grown crop in the UK. So you can sort of classify the different crops into three, really. You've got the nitrogen fixing crops, which have pretty low carbon emissions of less than 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per hectare. You've got low input cereals, which are crops like spring oats or spring barley, which have intermediate levels of carbon emissions, anything between 1,000 and 2,000 kilograms of CO2 per hectare. And then we've got high nitrogen input crops such as oilseed rape or milling wheat, which have carbon emissions of anything between over 2,000 to almost 3,000 kilograms of CO2 per hectare. So you can classify them in that sort of way. So that's looking at things in a per hectare basis. We can also look at the carbon emissions on a per ton of production basis. So the y-axis now is the kilograms of CO2 per ton of grain. You get a similar pattern. Legumes, maize and rye have the lowest carbon intensity per ton, which is down at less than 200 kilograms of CO2 per ton produced generally. Then you got the cereals, which are anything between 200 and just over 300 kilograms per ton of production. And then the oilseed rape and linseed are very high, but that's mainly because they've got a lower yield. So you're dividing the per hectare figure by quite a low yield of anything between 2 and 4 tons per hectare generally. So that's the reason that that's high. When we drill down further and we look at the sources of carbon emissions for different crops, then we see some interesting patterns. So this is for feed wheat, and you can see that the biggest source of carbon emissions are here, which is associated with the nitrous oxide emissions from the nitrogen fertilizer applied. And then second, we've got the carbon emissions coming from the manufacturer of that nitrogen fertilizer. Third is the fuel and electricity used for the operations, the cultivations, the harvest. And then we've got the fourth is the decomposition of crop residues following harvest. Next on the list, you've got the manure, nitrous oxide related emissions, and then you've got much smaller emissions from here we've got the non-nitrogen fertilizers, the phosphorus and potassium, sulfur fertilizers, and then we've got very low amounts, 2 and 1% of the seed that's planted, and the agrochemicals like fungicides and herbicides used. So you can get a pretty good picture there, and that's across a lot of crops. Oilseed rape is pretty similar, really, to the feed wheat. The main difference really is that you've got more emissions associated with the decomposition of your crop residues because you've got more crop residues from oilseed rape and it has a higher nitrogen content. But other than that, it's pretty similar, really, to the feed wheat. And then we've got a big difference, really, with the nitrogen fixing crops such as beans. Obviously, we haven't got any nitrogen fertilizer applied here, so that doesn't feature. So that means that the biggest source of emissions for beans are the fuel and electricity associated with the operations. So that's the cultivations, the harvest, etc. And then the next most is the decomposition of the crop residues after harvest. And then you've got pretty small amounts from the others. The seed for beans actually represents sort of the third biggest source because you've got maybe 200 kilograms per hectare of seed planted, which amounts to a bit more of the greenhouse gas emissions. So, in summary, the messages that we can categorize the greenhouse gas emissions on a per hectare basis into three types of crop. So you got your pulses like peas and beans, which are the lowest at 600 to 800 kilograms CO2 per hectare. You've got low nitrogen input cereals such as spring barley, intermediate between 1500 and 2000. And you got a high nitrogen input cereal such as milling wheat, oilseed rape at over 2000 kilograms of CO2 per hectare. In terms of the sources of emissions for cereals and oilseed rape, they're quite similar. Almost half are coming from the nitrogen fertilizer, both the manufacture and the nitrous oxide emissions upon application. You've got about 15% coming from manure or other organic materials. You've got 13 to 20% coming from the operations, the cultivations and the harvest, and you've got anything between 12 and 24% coming from the decomposition of residues following harvest. For pulses, very different. You've got 43% associated with operations and 33% associated with decomposition of residues. One really important thing we've noticed is that within any crop species, there's at least a threefold range in the carbon intensity between fields and between farms. So there's huge scope to reduce these, as you'll see later. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there. I hope that made sense, and we'll have a chance for some questions at the end of this sort of first session. I'm going to ask now Miguel to share his slides and give us sort of a bit of an overview of carbon emissions for crops grown in Spain, and particularly looking at some of the sort of Mediterranean region types of crop. So over to you, Miguel, if you want to share your slides.
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for inviting us to this session. I work for Coexpal. I'm an agronomist. Coexpal is an association of producers and exporters of fruits and vegetables in southern Spain. And I have to say, I must confess that we are not experts in the calculation of carbon footprint of or greenhouse gas emissions. We are just starting with the work within the framework of Climate Farm Demo project. So I had to contact some colleagues in Spain, and this is where I got the information that I'm going to show. So I okay.
Yep, that's shown fine. Thank you, Miguel.
Perfect, thanks. So yeah, Spain is most of the country lies within the so-called the Mediterranean climatic region, but it's not only Spain. It's also California, of course, the Mediterranean basin, some areas of Chile, South Africa, and the southern part of Australia. And this Mediterranean climate area is characterized by mild winters and very hot and dry summers. So we have, well, I've collected the figures from 5 major groups of crops. The first one would be the rain-fed cereals. In Spain, we have something more than 5 million hectares of this type of crops, and 300 hectares of rain-fed legumes, which is the second group that we're going to explain in this session. But of course, in Spain, there are many. Irrigation is key. Yeah? to allow the sustainability of many crops. So there are around 1 million hectares of irrigated grain and around 14,000 hectares of irrigated legumes. A third important crop for us is rice, the cultivation of rice, because it has a very distinct character, and you will understand this in the next few slides. Also, fourth group is open air vegetables, which is not really important in terms of area, of acreage, but it is in terms of because Spain is mostly an exports a lot of fruits and vegetables mostly to the European market. So there are around 150,000 hectares of open air vegetables. Most of them are irrigated. Only around 30,000 hectares are rain-fed. And then we have greenhouse vegetables, 76,000 hectares. Also mostly dedicated for the production is mostly dedicated for export, and the economical revenue is very important. So Spain is in Europe the largest country with organic agriculture, which is around 11% of the total agricultural area, something more than 2.5 million hectares. So some considerations before showing you the figures. The emission balances are dominated by fossil fuel use and the production of fertilizers. The emissions of nitrous oxides are low due to the low nitrogen application rates and also the low emission factors. And these low emission factors are explained by the low organic matter contents of the soils here. We have quite poor soils, agricultural soils in Spain due to the low organic matter contents. And also the humidity and the microbial activity of these soils is low, and this explains decrease in the mineralization processes that explain the emissions of nitrous oxides. So, as I just told you, the soil organic carbon in soil is low and is particularly relevant in this agroecosystem. So we enforce very much growers to try to increase these organic matter contents. So irrigation significantly increases greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture in Mediterranean regions. And after calculating carbon footprint, organic production significantly decreases the greenhouse gas emissions, despite lower yields per hectare. So this graph shows, and please do keep your attention on these bars surrounded by this red circle. This is the comparison between the emissions of CO2, the equivalent CO2 per hectare and year for winter cereals. Here is irrigated winter cereals, and this is rain-fed winter cereals. So as you see, the irrigation explains this large difference, right? Because of the energy consumption and also the higher yield needs for higher fertilizers supply. So it's important to make a difference when we talk about irrigated crops or rain-fed crops. This is a graph which is quite similar to the one that Pete showed us before. You can see the carbon footprint per kilogram of product on the left side and per hectare on the right side. So crops like rice, no matter the unit, they show a very high carbon footprint. But when we talk about crops like nuts, for instance, with very low carbon footprints per hectare, the low productivity makes this carbon footprint very high if we consider the unit, the kilogram of product. On the lower part of the of carbon footprint per kilogram of product, we see crops like citrus, also vegetables or tubers. These are intensive crops with very high productivities, which explain these low rates. So, concerning the greenhouse gas emission sources in Spain, we obtained this data from personal interviews, and then we applied the life cycle analysis methodology from the cradle to the farm gate perspective. And the sources that we considered as for greenhouse gas emissions were these 10 sources: manufacturing and maintenance of machinery, fuel production and combustion, soil and nitrous oxide emissions, fertilizer manufacturing, pesticide production, indirect nitrous oxide emissions, burning of biomass, emissions of methane, the soil carbon balance, and the greenhouse infrastructure. So these five major crops, they show if we represent the percentage of these emission factors expressed as kilograms of CO2 equivalent CO2 per hectare, we see that rain-fed and rain-fed cereals and legumes, they show quite a similar pattern, with the most important fractions due to fuel use and fertilizer production, right? These are these two graphs over here. But if we move on to rice, in rice, more than a half of the total emission is due to methane. And this is because the way rice is cultivated is paddy rice. The paddy field, the rice fields are flooded during some part of the production period, and the composition of organic matter explains these emissions of methane. If we move on to open air vegetables, again, most of the emissions are due to fuel use and fertilizer production. But if we compare open air vegetables with greenhouse vegetables, we see that almost half of in the case of greenhouse vegetables, almost one half of the total emission is due to the building, to the energy consumption of the greenhouse structure in itself. Also, in both vegetable systems, irrigation or emissions linked with the irrigation occupies quite an important fraction, which reaches 17% in the case of open air vegetables. If we change the way we represent the figures, and this is not a percentage, this is absolute terms expressed as equivalent kilograms of equivalent CO2 per hectare. Again, we see that in greenhouse vegetables, the most important fraction is due to the greenhouse itself, and in rice cultivation, this is methane, right? In the rest of crops, conventional open air vegetables, conventional rain-fed legumes, and rain-fed cereals, the most important fractions are due to fuel use and fertilizers. Okay. A similar pattern for the emissions of greenhouse gases expressed as grams of CO2, equivalent CO2 per kilogram of product, right? We see that except rice, the rest of the cropping systems are quite similar, but rice shows very high emissions per kilogram of product. And if we compare conventional with organic cropping systems, we see that except in the case of rice, organic growing systems show a decrease in the greenhouse gas emissions. In the case of rice, there is an increase because chemical fertilizers are substituted by organic fertilizers, and since the system provokes this high methane emissions due to the composition of organic matter, this total emissions is increasing in case of organic crops. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. If you have questions, I think we're going to have them at the end of the session. Thanks a lot.
That's brilliant, Miguel. I've learned a few things there, especially about rice. Thank you. There is one question for you in the chat, so I'm going to ask you to sort of try and reply to that during the next presentation if you can via chat. And I'm now going to hand over to Francis. If you can introduce yourself and share your slides, please, Francis. That's
Okay,
showing
can
nicely,
you see
Francis. Thank you.
my first slide? Okay, so I'm Francis Flenet. I'm an agronomist, and I work for the French Technical Institute for oilseed crops and also for grain legumes. The name of this institute is Terrinovia. And in the Climate Farm Demo project, I'm also a thematic leader for oilseed crops and also for grain legumes. So the calculations of greenhouse gas emissions were done with the label bas carbone for crops method, which is the French methodology for voluntary carbon market. In this method, the nitrous oxide emissions are calculated with the tier 1 of IPCC method. The emission factors are taken from French databases, and seed yields and cropping practices come from the statistics of the French Ministry of Agriculture. In this method, the emissions that are taken into account are operations, fertilizers manufacture, and fertilizers N2O emissions, crop residues, manure N2O emissions, and manure manufacture. The emissions due to operations are emissions coming from the fuel consumption of tractors and harvesters, and also from the use of energy for irrigation and also for drying grains. Fertilizers manufacture are in fact the manufacture and the transportation of mineral nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. N2O emissions are direct emissions and also indirect emissions coming from volatilization and leaching for N-fertilizer N2O emissions and manure N2O emissions, and only from leaching for crop residues. And we also take into account manufacture and transportation of organic fertilizers like manure, slurry, digestates, and so on. Some low emissions are not taken into account in this method. These emissions are the emissions for the manufacture and transportation of pesticides, and also for the manufacture of equipment. This slide presents the greenhouse gas emissions for the 5 major crops in France, which are winter wheat, grain corn, forage corn, winter barley, and also winter oilseed rape. In these figures, you can see the total greenhouse gas emissions in the black column, and also the share of the different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. In winter wheat, as you can see, almost half of the emissions result from mineral and fertilizer N2O emissions, and more than a quarter of the emissions come from fertilizer manufacture. In winter barley, the total greenhouse gas emissions are slightly lower than in winter wheat because the amount of N-fertilizer, mineral N-fertilizer, is lower than in winter wheat, while the amount of organic fertilizer is a bit higher. In the three other crops, the total greenhouse gas emissions are higher than in winter wheat, despite lower amounts of mineral and fertilizer. But on the other hand, the amount of organic fertilizer is greater for these three other crops than for winter wheat, especially for forage corn, because this crop is mainly cultivated in livestock farms, so they receive great amounts of organic fertilizer. As a result, the emissions resulting from the application of manure and from manure manufacture is almost 50% of the is more than 50% of the total emissions. In grain corn and also in winter oilseed rape, because the amounts of organic fertilizers are greater than in winter wheat, the share of emissions resulting from manure N2O emissions and also manure manufacture is greater than in winter wheat. This slide presents the emissions of winter wheat compared to the emissions of pea, which is the major grain legume in France, and the emissions of sunflower, which is the major low input crop in France. In pea, the total emissions are almost 4 times lower than in winter wheat, because these crops receive almost no mineral N fertilizer. So the main sources, the main source of emissions is operations, and the second most important source of emissions is crop residues. In sunflower, the total emissions are twice lower than in winter wheat, because this crop receives low amounts of N fertilizers. For this reason, the share of emissions resulting from the other sources than N fertilizer, N2O emissions, and fertilizer manufacture are greater. As you can see, emissions coming from N fertilizer, N2O emissions, and also from fertilizer manufacture are less than 50% of the total emissions, and the emissions of operations is 23% of the total emissions, and the emissions due to crop residues is 18% of the total emissions.
Excellent. Thank you, Francis. That was brilliant. It's reassuring that quite a lot of your calculations are similar to ours in the UK, so that's good news. I think.
Yeah. So we can compare.
Exactly. Yeah. If you have any questions for Francis, then put them in the chat, please. I'll now hand over to Madhkan and ask her to introduce herself and start showing her slides.
Yes, thank you. I'll just find my slides. So I'm from the Innovation Center for Organic Farming in Denmark. So we're a private knowledge institution, quite a new organization actually. We were funded in 2021. So some of you might know Sigus Innovation from Denmark. So we're sort of the organic cousin to SIGIS. We're quite a similar institution as them. And we also cooperate a lot with them. But yeah, I'm a consultant in this Innovation Center for Organic Farming, working mainly with climate and climate calculations. We have actually also been part of a development of the ES Green Tool climate calculation tool, which is available for farmers for climate advisory services. So I'm just going to talk more about the organic crops, also in relation to Denmark, of course. And because it's organic, it might be a little bit different than from the conventional, because for the organic crop production, our emission sources are related to the application of manure and other types of organic fertilizers. We also have the crop residues, liming, diesel, electricity, and seeds, of course. But this means that we don't have, because we cannot use the pesticides and we cannot use mineral fertilizers, we also don't have these emissions from the production of these types of applications. So it's a little bit different. What I've used for these calculations here is data from a field management system called Mark Online. It translates to field online. So it's a field organization program which most farmers use. It's owned by SIGIS, and I think they estimate that about 85 to 90% of the farm area is actually covered by this system. So it's a very good coverage using data from Mark Online. So here they put in, for example, fertilizer levels, and also yields will be put in for planning the fertilizer levels of the crops. So the data set we have is for all organic farmers using Mark Online, and just to put in relation, in Denmark, approximately 11.5% of the farming area is organic, and this is about 4,000 farmers that are organic. So it's also quite a big amount of farmers, and also using Mark Online, of course. I've done a calculation on 3 different crop types for this purpose here. And just to clarify, I don't have the emissions from seeds and electricity due to lack of data. So this will not be included. And of course, this will make the actual carbon footprint a bit higher than what is stated here, but just to be clear about that. So I've included clovergrass, rotational clovergrass that is being cut, and oats and faba bean. And the reason we use clovergrass is that it's actually quite an important organic crop for also not just for the animal husbandry, but also for the plant producers, because it gives nitrogen into the system, and also for soil fertility. And actually, just to put also this into relation, about 46% of the organic farm areas actually being grown with different types of clover grass or grass. So it is a very important crop in the organic system. So that's also why I've put it here. And as you see, for the clover grass, a big part of the emissions come from manure application. So this would be both the direct nitrous oxide emissions and also indirect from ammonia. That comes from the manure application. But also crop residues are actually quite a big contributor to the carbon footprint of clovergrass, of course, because the crop residues are very high in nitrogen. So this is a big contributor as well. For the oats, it looks a bit different because a higher proportion of the emissions come from the manure. And also from diesel, it's a bit more energy intensive in this way. And for the faba beans, there is some emissions from manure application. And just to clarify that, of course, the faba beans, being a legume, is not fertilized for the N effect, but it's fertilized for the phosphorus and potassium effect. And since it's organic, we have to use different types of organic amendment. So this could be composted, what do you call it, garden waste. So it has a very, very low nitrogen effect, but the amount of total nitrogen in the application can be quite big, therefore also contributing to some of the carbon footprint here. But other than this, also again, crop residues are quite high for the faba bean, also because of the high nitrogen content of the crop residues from this type of crop. And shown in a little bit of a different way, I've put it like this. So just to compare between the crops, you can see that the clovergrass and the oats are quite at level. And I find it quite interesting that these are actually, compared to what Pete presented, they're actually quite low in carbon footprint when you measure it as per hectare. And of course, this is also because we're nitrogen limited in some way in the organic farming system. So we don't have the same amount of nitrogen available for the organic farms as compared to conventional. So this is very clear from these values. Yeah, again, effects on soil carbon is not included here, so this would maybe change the picture a little bit, especially for the clovergrass. But again, the clovergrass is an important crop for the organic farmers for the nitrogen fixation and soil fertility. I just included this as well, so I wanted to see when we show it per kilogram of product, and in the case of the clovergrass, it's per feed unit. It changes the picture quite a bit. We have quite high yields in the clovergrass, also giving this lower emission per product unit. And here it changes, so the faba bean is actually the one with the highest, also because it has quite a low yield compared to the other two crops. Yes, I think that was what I had.
That's good. Thank you, Mashkin. Yeah, you're right. Your cereals like oats is probably about half of the greenhouse gas emissions per hectare compared with our calculations on the conventional side. Interestingly, your beans were very similar to ours.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you said, the sort of lack of nitrogen fertilizer makes the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I've seen some questions in the chat which have come up, so keep going with that. That looks good. I can see the answers coming in as well. That's fabulous. Andrea, I think we have got time to look at your slides, if that's okay. So perhaps if you could share and introduce yourself, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah. My name is Andrea Aponesson. I'm working at Agovest, which is a quite small private company in the western part of Sweden. We're not exactly an advisory organization. We're working with various types of projects and also trying to kind of link academia with more practical implementation of agriculture. I'm an agronomist, not a specialist in greenhouse gas emissions, more into the plant pathology and so on. I'm just going to say that I think we have a similar way of doing the calculations as you do in what have been presented previously from UK, Denmark, and France. This graph shows the emissions per hectare. We have a bit slightly higher than UK. I can also say that this is for the conventional agriculture. In Sweden, we have basically a cereal-based agriculture, rain-fed mainly. What is specific for Sweden is that we have quite long and hard winters and also longer days, which also affects the biomass growth quite a lot. But of course, it differs if you're in the north of Sweden or in the south. But this is the more specific conditions for Sweden. But the emissions per hectare is a bit higher than what you presented for UK, Pete. I think it's because we have a bit lower yields. For instance, the winter wheat, maybe we have about 7 to 11 or 12 tons, while you are a bit higher, I would guess, like 9 to 14 something. Spring barley is also a bit higher, and I think it's the yields. Then the sugar beet wasn't supposed to be in here, but I borrowed the graph from a already made presentation. The winter oilseed rape is a bit higher as well. Requires quite a lot of nitrogen, and similarly the peas are lower, as we've seen before. The emissions per kilogram is similar. Here the oilseed rape is significantly higher than the cereals, and the peas, of course, lower. Yeah, I mean, it's I would say that it's pretty much the same as in UK and the northern part of Europe. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. That's super. So that now we've got an opportunity for any questions. If anybody wanted to verbally ask a question, then please raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can carry on putting your questions in the chat. It's a chance to pause, really. Hi, Laura. You can unmute yourself, so please ask away.
Hi everyone, so I'm Laure from Arvalis, French Technical Institute of Applied Research in Arable Crops. So it's not really a question, but more of a reflection after seeing all these graphs. I think it would be very interesting if we could all share the methodology of our calculation to see what's similar, what's different, and maybe, I'm not sure if it's planned in the Climate Farm demo project, but I think it would be very, very interesting. At least I'm interested.
I entirely agree as well. Yes, we should share the detail. I mean, what is reassuring is that I think we're coming to the same conclusions about the general size of the carbon emissions for different crop species, which are more, which are less. So we'll probably have a similar ranking. And we're coming to similar conclusions, I think, about what the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions are, with it being nitrogen fertilizer for those crops which receive nitrogen fertilizer, for example, and the residue decomposition, for example, is significant. But yeah, in terms of it, so that's good. You know, it means we can focus on the right things, I think, with some consensus. And there's obviously some crops which are very different, like rice and the glasshouse crops, which are very different sort of areas to focus on. But you're right that there's going to be differences in the detail of how we're calculated, and it would be just good to sort of check where there's any major differences there. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts? If you don't want to sort of say them verbally, just put them in the chat. It'd be good to capture all of that. Okay, well, let's move on to the second part of the meeting, which is focused on mitigation now. And to do this, we're going to have the same sort of set of presenters talking about the mitigation side now. We've got fewer slides to go through, so I've put all the slides into one slide deck, and I'm going to share them. And when it comes to the other presenters, just tell me to move on to the next slide, please, and I'll move it on. So let's get that loaded up. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Good. Okay. When I put the next slide up, don't be alarmed. It looks complicated and it has got a lot of data, but it is, I think, a very interesting slide and tells us a lot. So this is a slide which summarizes all of our winter feed wheat data. And what it shows, just get my pointer working. What it shows is the greenhouse gas intensity in kilograms of CO2 per tonne of yield. I notice most of your presenters describe this in terms of kilograms of yield. So this is per tonne of yield, which is why it's about 100 times, 1,000 times larger than the other ones. And it's ranked each column is a different field. And you've got the field here on the left-hand side, which has the highest carbon intensity of over 500 kilograms of CO2 per tonne, all the way through to the other end of the graph, which shows the field with the lowest carbon intensity, which was less than 200 kilograms of CO2 per tonne. So you can see there's a massive range between fields in the UK, all grown for winter wheat. You can see within each column how the sources of greenhouse gas emissions are sort of changed. And this really just reiterates the importance of nitrogen fertilizer, both from a manufacturer and nitrous oxide emissions perspective in contributing to those greenhouse gas emissions. What we've also got on this graph are the yields, the grain yields of each of these crops in the yellow dots. And you can see there's a gradual trend for higher yields associated with the crops with the lower greenhouse gas emissions per tonne, which is interesting in itself, I think, in that it shows that it is possible to get high yielding crops which also have a low carbon emissions associated with their production. And we've done similar graphs for other crop species, such as oilseed rape and beans, and we get a similar type of relationship that high yielding crops tend to have lower carbon emissions per tonne of production. Now, what we've done with this data set is to partition it up and compare the bottom 1/3 of crops which have the highest carbon intensity, so this region here, and we've compared these with these crops here at the other end, which have the lowest carbon intensity, and we've compared the crop management methods of those two sets of crops to see if there are any statistically significant differences in the way that those crops are grown. And the idea is that this will give us some ideas about what areas of management we need to focus on to minimise greenhouse gas emissions and yet maintain productivity. So this is a summary of this analysis, and I'll take you through it carefully. So what we have here is the different metrics and management methods that we've measured and captured from the farmer. And of course, all this data is based on almost 160 wheat crops grown. So there's a lot of data within this. We've got this column here is the lower 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne crops. So those are on the left-hand side of the graph, if you remember. Wait a minute, no, it's the other way around, isn't it? These are on the right-hand side of the graph, if you remember. And then we've got the crops which have the highest greenhouse gas emissions per tonne, which, if you remember, were on the left-hand side of the graph. So what we find is that for crops with the lower greenhouse gas emissions per tonne did have a significantly greater yield, 10.8 tonnes per hectare compared with 9 tonnes per hectare. They had a lower amount of nitrogen fertilizer applied, 159 kilograms of N per hectare compared with 198. So they're yielding more, but they needed less nitrogen fertilizer to achieve that. 31% of those crops had some sort of fertilizer efficiency additive applied, either a nitrification inhibitor or a urease inhibitor, compared with just 6% for the crops with the high carbon intensity. And then, interestingly, we also found that the lower greenhouse gas emission crops had less manure applied. Now, we don't want to give a message that crops shouldn't receive manure or organic materials. They should. It's a brilliant way of improving the organic matter of the soil. It's a way of providing nutrients and not relying on synthetically produced fertilizers. But it is a fact that when we calculated greenhouse gas emissions, the crops which had the lower greenhouse gas emissions had less manures applied. It's also interesting to note that the crops with the lower greenhouse gas emissions had more direct drilled. So you got almost double of the crops were direct drilled with the lower greenhouse gas emissions compared with the high greenhouse gas emission crops. Anything else to pick out here? Well, the other one is the greenhouse gas emissions from the phosphorus, potassium and lime fertilizer. It's a similar story to the manures, really, in that the crops with the lower greenhouse gas emissions also had less phosphorus and potassium and lime applied. Now, we don't want to give a message that that's the wrong thing to do, because it isn't. You need to maintain phosphorus and potassium levels, and you need to get the right pH in the soil. And then many of these inputs are applied rotationally, so it's likely that these inputs would have been applied somewhere else within the rotation. But it was just a fact of these data set that was the relationship we found. So the messages from that analysis were that crops with low greenhouse gas emissions per tonne tended to have higher yields. They tended to have a lower rate of synthetic fertilizer and more of the fertilizer efficiency products, such as nitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors. They had less intensive cultivations, more direct drill crops, for example. There was less energy used to dry the grain. But we also found that wheat was more often following a non-cereal break crop. So they had a first wheat really was more common for the lower greenhouse gas emission crops. But we also found that the low greenhouse gas emission crops had less manures and less P and K fertilizer. But we need to recognise that those things would have been applied elsewhere in rotation probably, and we don't want to say they're a bad thing at all. It's one of the challenges we've got, I think, is of getting the management of those right to maintain productivity. Okay, I'm going to move next on to Miguel. So over to you, Miguel.
Okay, just go on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm trying to include in this table some qualitative criteria on which should be or where should be put our efforts to enforce growers to adopt some agronomically sound measures for mitigation. So some of these measures are technological measures, like and others are agroecological practices, right? So the first one is a typical technological measure, and this is to adjust the nitrogen fertilization to the needs of the crop. There are many growers in Mediterranean areas who don't use data from soil analysis to make decisions on how to fertilize the crops. So it is needed to do some soil analysis and use some kind of calculation models to adopt the most efficient fertilization practices. So there are, of course, some limitations, technical limitations, because it's needed to have frequent and good soil analysis, economical because this type of this analysis and the use of sensors, it of course it increases the costs of production, but on the other hand, you may lower your expenses in fertilizers if you optimize these strategies, right? Also to replace some synthetic fertilizers with manure, to adopt the use of organic fertilizers. Of course, this is very much aligned with some common agricultural policy and Green Deal strategies to use the soil as a carbon sink, right? There are some legal restrictions. At least in my area, there are some nitrate sensitive areas, so the total amount of nitrogen, organic nitrogen used is limited. Also to improve technology used for irrigation and fertigation, to optimize not only the supply of fertilizer, but also the supply of water, which in irrigated areas is key, especially in drought periods like the one that we are experiencing now. And also within this first group of technological measures, another one would be the use of nitrification and urease inhibitors, right? Within the second group, agroecological practices, I would include the use of biochar as a way to increase the soil organic carbon and to kind of immobilize carbon within the soil, to have a permanent source of carbon within soils. Next slide, please. Also, another sources of organic fertilizers like composted sludge. Very important, the use of harvest residues and byproducts. We are enforcing growers to use them when the yield is finished, to try to recover the functionalities of the soil, and also to implement circular economy practices. Of course, this is also to make an efficient use of these sources of fertilizers. Is also very important to have firstly adopted these technological related measures, because it is very much needed to know the specific properties of the organic fertilizer you're using in your fields. Very important also the adoption of low non-tillage practices. But that, on the other hand, this may kind of oblige for the use of herbicides in some cases. So, and this might have consequences in some environmental consequences. Okay, and then at last, the use of cover crops and crop rotations to diversify the species grown in the farms, to improve by incorporating their crop residues into the soil, improve the soil organic contents, and at the same time to decrease the pressure of pests and soil-borne diseases. And I think that's all. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Miguel. That's really good. I emphasize that if you have any questions for any of us, just put them in the chat and we'll endeavour to answer them during the next slides. Thank you again, Miguel. So over now to Laura.
Thank you very much, Pete. So yeah, Lonely Chelm, I already introduced myself. So today I'd like to present some results for different mitigation levers on crop production for French crop. Next slide, please. So Francis already introduced you and explained to you the low carbon method for arable crop. So we use this method to calculate GHG emissions and also soil carbon storage, but I will not mention that today. So in this method, there are several levers available for GHG mitigation associated with fossil fuel consumption on one end and with fertilization and crop residue on the other end. So for fossil fuel consumption, we take into account the reduction of fossil fuel consumption by agricultural machinery, such as a number of passage on field, reduced tillage. We also take into account environmentally friendly driving techniques, auto guidance, electric engine, etc. We also take into account biofuel consumption. We also take into account fossil fuel consumption of thermic pump used for irrigation. We do not take into account electric pump in the low carbon method for arable crops in France because our electric mix in France is mostly based on nuclear energy and has a low carbon impact. And we also take into account GHG mitigation based on reduction of fossil fuel consumption during drying and storage of grain at farm. So that was for the fossil fuel consumption, and for the fertilization, we take into account more levers, such as a reduction of the quantity of mineral nitrogen applied by using, for example, N balance, or taking into account climatic conditions, using decision support tools, or intraplot modulation for N supply. We take into account the introduction of leguminous plant or crop with low nitrogen requirement in crop rotation. The liming of acid soil, which has an initial pH of 6.8. Indeed, when you have acid soil, it will emit more N2O emission due to microbic, I'm not sure of the word, due to life in the soil. We also use nitrification inhibitors, and we take into account the use of nitrification inhibitors and the reduction of nitrogen volatilization, either by burying mineral and organic fertilizer when applied, when using less emissive fertilizer, or using inhibitors of ureas. Next slide, please. So in our study, we focus mainly on GHG mitigation associated with fertilization, and we studied almost all levers that I presented earlier, except for liming of acid soil, because we didn't have any acid soil in our study. Next slide, please. Maybe can you show the whole slide? I shouldn't have. Okay, that's good. Perfect. So our study focused on 10 case studies that represented high performance agricultural farm, both in economical and technical terms. And we study farms all around France, so in the north and south of France. And in almost each of our farm, we study levers of reduction of N quantity and change in fertilizer form, introduction of leguminous crop in the rotation, and I forgot to present it in the next slide, adding cover crops between the different crop of the rotation. So we calculated both emission from fertilization and fossil fuel consumption, And we studied our reference scenario, which was the baseline of the farm, based on the three-year period. And then we studied project scenarios where we applied our low carbon levers, so N quantity and form, leguminous crop and cover crop, introduction of cover crop. And we calculated the difference of GHG emission between the reference scenario and the project scenario. Next slide, please. Oh, can you show? Yeah, thank you. So on the left hand of the slide, you can see the GHG emission from the reference scenario. So the baseline scenario without application of the levers. So we had the GHG emission from the farm were mainly due by fertilization and crop residue GHG emission from 1.7 to 2.5 ton of equivalent CO2 per hectare and per year. So it accounts from 42 to 16% of the total. Just by looking at the number, I'm really sorry, I forgot to change this number. It doesn't add up to 100% because we also study in this study the soil carbon storage. So yeah, don't look at the number; it's wrong. And for combustible, so GHG emission from combustion of fuel, it varies from 0.2 to 0.3 ton of equivalent CO2 per hectare and per year. And on the right hand of the graph, you can see the GHG mitigation potential of project compared to their reference scenario. So for the three levers I presented you. So for quantity and type of mineral fertilizer, it varies from 0.2 to 0.82 ton of equivalent CO2 per hectare and per year of mitigation potential. For the introducing leguminous plants in rotation, it varies from 0.1 to 0.89 ton of equivalent of CO2 equivalent per hectare and per year. And finally, when introducing or expanding cover crop in our rotation, it varies from minus 0.07 to 0.17 ton of equivalent CO2 per hectare and per year. And you can see on the graph the variation of GHG mitigation potential for each levers. So you see that when you introduce cover crops in rotation, you might have a little bit more of GHG emission than the reference scenario, and it's mainly due to crop residue of GHG emission from crop residue of the cover crops that might sometimes emit more emissions. Okay, next slide, please. So in conclusion, GHG mitigation varies between levers and their applicability to the case study. I'd like to point out that we study high-performance agricultural farms, and there could be more room for improvement and therefore more GHG mitigation potential for a farm with average performance. And also, we have to keep in mind, because this was a theoretical study, but in real agricultural farms, we have to keep in mind the feasibility of the project, and some levers are quite difficult to implement, for example, cover crops, and are very much dependent of climatic events. And as I said before, our study initially focused on GHG mitigation and soil carbon storage. And when you introduce soil carbon storage in the carbon balance of our crops, results for levels vary greatly when adding soil carbon storage. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Again, any questions for Laura, put them in the chat, please, and we'll also get a chance to say, if you want to, at the end of this session. Okay, I'll move on to Majken now.
Yes. Yeah, you can just move on to the next slide. Of course, this is a lot focused again on the organic production, but just some of the main levers that we can use in the organic production is related to the application of nitrogen. So here I stated it as use less manure nitrogen, but of course this is also related to the efficiency of the organic fertilizers that are being used, because if you use fertilizers with a very low N efficiency, you will have a very large amount of total nitrogen being applied. And this is the amount that we calculate the amount of nitrous oxide from. So if you use low efficiency fertilizers, it can be a lever to use higher efficiency fertilizers. In this relation, it is also that many of the organic farmers in Denmark are actually under this what do you say, the bio scheme. Actually, it's a bio scheme under the organic production, where you can use under 65 kilograms of effective nitrogen per hectare, and then you get a extra subsidy for this. Of course, this is related to the effective end. Some of them might actually use low efficiency fertilizers, and therefore switching to higher efficiency fertilizer can reduce their nitrous oxide emissions. Jumping over the cover crops in the first relation, I want to go to the clover grass, because this can actually in Denmark also be used as an energy crop. Organic clover grass can be used as an energy crop for biogas plants. So for some plant producers with low access to manure, for example, it can be an option if they have a biogas plant nearby that can deliver their fertilizers. It is a possibility to grow clover grass, deliver it to the biogas plant, and then get a very efficient fertilizer back. So this is perhaps a lever that will become more available in the future for the organic farmers. So of course it also delivers some nitrogen fixation, which puts more nitrogen into the system. And if this results in a lower use of manure, then you will have a lower nitrous oxide emission from that source. And then again, we have the cover crops, and this is very broadly used in Denmark, probably in other countries across the EU, as environmental lever, so to reduce nitrate leaching. But it can also be used for maintaining the nitrogen in the soil, which could be delivered to the next crop. It has also become possible to use nitrogen fixing cover crops. So this can be an extra possibility, but again, to reduce emissions, it will be necessary to also reduce the amount of fertilizer being used, or of course increase the yields if we calculate it as per kilogram of product. Next slide, please. Some of the more technical mitigation options that are coming are biochar. So this is for carbon sequestration, of course, and for organic, there is only the option of using biochar based on plant material. So that would be straw or wood-based biochar, but it is a possibility. The conventional farmers are also able to use biochar that is based on the fiber fraction, for example, from biogas plants. So they have a broader range of opportunities for using biochar compared to organic farmers. And I also want to mention nitrification inhibitors. This is of course not available for organic farmers. This can only be used by the conventionals, but this is a mitigation option that is being talked a lot about in Denmark. I believe it is also being used quite broadly for the production of maize, because there you actually also see an increase in yield from using the nitrification inhibitors. Of course, as from the organic sector, we hope that maybe we can find some natural substances that could be used as natural nitrification inhibitors that would be available for organic farmers. Yes, that's what I had.
Excellent. Thank you, Majkan. Yeah, it's important to focus on organic crops because they're such a significant proportion of the land area in the EU, aren't they? So we need to deal with these carefully.
Yes.
And finally, move on to Andrea to talk about her mitigation ideas.
Yes, thanks. This maybe doesn't apply for the more Mediterranean area, but in Sweden and in, I guess, most part of Northern Europe, we have a problem during winter, autumn and winter, and also spring with excessive water. So what we talk about in Sweden quite a lot is the subsurface drainage, which will be both a mitigation and adaptation measure. So basically you empty the soil of excessive water, which makes the root system larger. It can go deeper. It also has a beneficial effect on the nutrient uptake. And also it dries up the soil earlier, of course. In spring, you can start prepare the soil and seed it earlier, and also after heavy rains, you can start working on the field much earlier. And also within a field, if there is some areas where there is a lot of water or more moist, it tend to be an uneven maturity of the crop. But if you have a better drainage, there is a more even maturity, so there may be less need for drying the cereals. And also, especially for Sweden, and when we have winters with maybe 20 minus for not for months, but like this year it started snowing already in November, and until last week we had snow coming and going, but it can be very cold in periods, and it affects the crop quite a lot when you have ice and water standing in the field. So yeah, that's basically it for that slide.
Yeah.
Did you take the other ones, or?
No, I've just put that one in, Andrea. That's the last one. That's really useful. It's an area I hadn't really considered that strongly, but it is a massive issue. I mean, especially in the UK this year, the amount of waterlogged soils we have in the UK is a lot, and it's going to affect productivity. It's going to affect sort of the efficiency of which the crops use, fertilizers especially. So yeah, I think that's an important area.
Yeah, I think in Sweden, most of the subsurface drainage was done maybe 50 years ago, and now there is a great need of doing the maintenance. Well, some maintenance have been done, but with the climate change, with more heavy rains and so on, there is a need to look over it again, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you all. That was brilliant. Yeah, while I've been presenting, I haven't been able to look at the chat, so I can see there's quite a lot of questions and answers coming in, so that's brilliant. This is now a chance for anybody who wants to speak verbally and raise their hand, and we can unmute your microphone if you want to make a longer comment or anything like that before we move on to the sort of final phase of the meeting. Okay, that's fine. If you do think of anything, just put it in the chat or raise your hand. We were going to move on now to sort of thinking about what are the main knowledge gaps for advisors, farm advisors, and Ben's going to launch a poll, which if you could, with some ideas for what the main knowledge gaps are, and it might not be comprehensive. So if you think of another one, then please click other and write it into the chat so we can capture all of your ideas, please. So the poll's been launched. Thank you, Ben. Click on one of the options or other and put the other in the chat. Let's see what we get. I'm going to pause here for a minute or two to let everybody have a think and make their response. So I can see we've got 14 responses so far. Might be a few more. Oh, there's some more coming in. That's good. At the moment, we've got soil carbon management winning as the biggest knowledge gap for advisors. And that's something we haven't focused on in today's meeting, but could well be a topic for future meetings. And we've also got nutrient management and emissions from crop residues as the next two most common ones. Doesn't look like we've got any others in that list which are coming up. Okay, well that's very useful. We'll capture that information and make sure it's available for future. That gives us a good idea for maybe where we need to focus on in future meetings as well. Any comments about that? Anything we're missing there, do you think? Any surprises that anybody wants to raise their hand and make a comment about or mention anything in the chat? Okay, good. Right, so the next item I'd like to go through is what we should focus on for our next meetings. The plan for the sort of thematic crop management area is to have 2 or 3 meetings per year. One of these can be, with the annual meeting when we meet up later in the year, but probably 2 online meetings per year is what we're aiming for. What topics should we focus on? So, Ben, if you could load up the next poll and give us a chance to vote on that. And again, this is not sort of a comprehensive list of ideas, it's just a list of ideas which we came up with, but there may be others. And if there are others, click on other and add it into the chat and we can capture that then. Okay, so there we've got a top being the relationship between nutrient management, yield and emissions. And then we've got 2 at a similar level, soil management and yield emissions, and most effective greenhouse gas emission methods. And I should say that the soil management aspect, I'm thinking maybe that could encompass carbon storage in the soil as well. But I think it's an important question as to how much we want to focus on soil carbon storage. Getting some views on that would be useful for me.
Could you repeat, Pete? Please, sorry.
Yeah, my question to everybody really is to what extent you would be interested in focusing on soil carbon storage and methods for doing that. And
I think there's Paul who wants to talk.
yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, that'd be a useful conversation. I think we could cover soil carbon storage and adaptation. I put a comment in about adaptation in the chat as well, whether we need to be sort of considering that in the round or whether it's a separate conversation. But soil quality, soil health, capacity of soil to sequester more carbon.
Yeah.
In the context of adaptation, I think would be useful.
Yep. Yep.
But I think there's two things. Yep. When we're sort of considering the different subjects, it's both where are the biggest gains to be made in terms of mitigation, but also where are the knowledge gaps, and we're sort of looking at the knowledge gaps now. So I think it's sort of where do the two meet really in terms of knowledge gaps and sort of capacity for biggest wins.
Yep. 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 So yeah, I mean, it's looking like maybe the focus of our next meetings will be on those top three there: the relationship between nutrient management, yield, soil management, and most effective greenhouse gas mitigation methods. One of those will probably be at the main meeting when we meet up physically. Yeah, okay. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Can I maybe just put in regarding the soil carbon sequestration? I think we're talking a lot about when you sort of reach your maximum level of carbon in the soil.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
how do we deal with this interaction between avoided emissions from keeping the carbon in the soil, and when do we actually talk about carbon sequestration, and how do we account for this in individual carbon or climate calculations? I think this is a very difficult question, and I mean, the farmers are very interested in the carbon sequestration, but we're really struggling scientifically of how to account for it correctly on a farm basis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a very difficult thing to measure. Full stop. Yeah. So, yes. Yeah, and we could spend a very long time discussing this. That's why I sort of asked the question really, whether we should be focusing on the sort of lowest hanging fruit to help the advisors make, progress in the short term for minimizing carbon emissions associated with crop production, and sort of save the soil carbon sequestration questions and methods until a bit later into the project is one thought that I had. Okay. We've got an action to share the methodology between the presenters. I'd also like to be able to put the presentations which we've just gone through today onto the Climate Farm demo SharePoint, so everybody's got access to those. Presenters, let me know if there's any slides that you don't want to be put onto there, and I can circulate where the location of that SharePoint folder is so others can access it. I'll put some ideas out for the next meeting, topic and dates, and we can move forward. Is there anybody else that we should be inviting to these thematic meetings that you can think of? Have we got the right audience here? I sort of focused on national coordinators, but we've got, a few different people here. We've got some demo farmers here as well, I know. So there's a range, and I think, we can be as inclusive as possible and include as many different stakeholders within the project as possible. Okay. I'm going to give one more sort of chance for anybody else to raise a comment, raise a point before we finish the meeting.
Paul is saying that more demo farmers would be good.
Yep.
In the
Thank
chat.
you, Laura. Good point. Right, we'll make that point. Good. So, well, it remains me to thank all the presenters for some excellent presentations, really concise. Everybody kept to time. They were really clear. Thank you very much for all your help with that. Thanks everybody for joining and contributing so fully in the chat as well. That was all very good. And I look forward to the next meeting, really. Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you, Pete, for
Pete.
the organization.
Yeah, for the organization.
Bye
Thanks.
bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.